on Nova Legends podcast, I have Steve Buckhantz, longtime Wizard announcer, a guy I listen to at least 3 or 4 times a week for many, many years. Steve, I told my mother last night I was interviewing you, and I've done some pretty big names. She was so excited, and I said, "How would you describe?" Yeah, because she watches every game. I said, "How would you describe Steve Buckhantz? What did he mean to you?" He said he was just so enthusiastic and passionate, and he would say the funniest things. He had the funniest phrases that he would use, and I just love listening to him. So anyway, welcome.
Well, that's really nice. I'm not sure your mom has her priorities quite in order, but I appreciate that, and tell her thank you so much for that. That makes me feel really good. It's great to be with you, Julian, and I've seen some of your podcasts and listened to some of them, and you've had some great guests. So it's a great thing to do. It gives you an opportunity to talk to people and find out about what they're all about. And you have no real time structures, which unlike regular TV, it's a great tool to be able to use.
Oh, well, thanks. That's coming from you. That's high compliment. I really appreciate that. Well, look, I don't know. A lot of folks may not know that you're from Arlington. So why don't we start? I was talking to Pat Toomey, who played for the Cowboys in the 70s. He was a star for Edison. And he told me when he went to school at Edison, it was a country school. It was way out there because Fairfax County was just building up. And he said that it was the city schools, and I never thought of Arlington schools as city schools. But he was saying it was Washington Lee, it was Wakefield, and in some regard Yorktown that were the sports kings at the time. The Fairfax schools were smaller and just building. So why don't you take us back to where you were raised and kind of what it was like growing up in Arlington back then?
Well, I was actually born in the district at the Columbia Hospital for Women, which is no longer. I don't think they wanted to make the same mistake twice, so they tore that down. And raised in Arlington, my dad was in the building business and built a couple of houses that we lived in for the longest time, right there off of Military Road, Nellie Custis. When you're growing up, you have your close friends and then people around you. I didn't even know this, but right around the corner from me, Sandra Bullock grew up and went to my high school as well, Washington Lee High School, which is now Washington Liberty. And she's 9 years younger than me, so she came later. And obviously way before that, we had some really famous folks coming out of there. Warren Beatty and Shirley MacLaine went to a brother and sister, and they went to Washington Lee High School. And a number of great athletes came out of there. Jake Scott, who obviously played for the Skins and Miami Dolphins, the Super Bowl MVP. Reggie Harrison. So many great players that came out of there. Basketball and football, we had a guy named John Hummer who was a star with the Buffalo Braves when he came out of Washington Lee High School. But I grew up there, and you're right, it was W&L, Wakefield, and Yorktown. O'Connell really wasn't. I mean, they had a team. In fact, they used to play their games at Washington Lee on Friday night because they didn't have a stadium with lights or really any kind of stadium. Now I think they do, but that was obviously before the Metcalfs and all of those guys. And so we had a really good sports program at Washington Lee. Our baseball coach, a guy named Del Norwood, was pretty legendary. Our crewing coach, Charlie Butts, who also passed away, Washington Lee had a great crew team, forever. And they used to practice down there on the Potomac, right by the boathouse where they had all their crew stuff. All our sports teams were good. Our baseball teams, everybody's, basketball, soccer, everything was really great. So that's where I grew up before I went off to college at James Madison.
So were you really into sports yourself? Did you play? Were you like the broadcast, the play-by-play guy, not the play-by-play guy, but the announcer at the football and basketball games? Did you?
Well, I did. It's funny because I did get into communications early. I mean, when I was in high school, I did the morning announcements on the radio. We called it the WLHS, Washington Lee High School announcements on the radio. Not the radio, but the PA system. So that went out everywhere. And also I did the PA announcing for the men's junior varsity basketball, which was really cool. But played sports, in junior high. I went to Stratford Junior High and played on the football team and the basketball team. And then when I got to high school, too small to play hoops, but I played football. And I was a place kicker and a punter and played guard. And I still have my, I don't know if you're you can see this, but I still have my square-toed shoe
Oh, yeah.
that I used to place kick with that I modeled after the one Mark Mosley had, same model, Wilson model, I think. And that's when kickers were straight on. You know, there was no soccer style kickers. Everybody was straight on. So I did do that in high school at WNL, and then also got into, like I say, the communications aspect of it. I actually, with another fellow, tried to start a radio station. We went down to the FCC and filled out a bunch of paperwork, and then realized it would be impossible to do and too much trouble. But we did give it a go. And so, you know, when I went off to college, I remember I applied at 3 schools: AU, University of Miami in Florida, and Madison, and got accepted at all 3. I actually went to Miami for a semester in Florida, which I didn't like as much. And it was so big, I had really no chance of getting involved in the radio station. So I transferred after 1 semester to what was then Madison College. And at the time, 7,500 students. And when I went to the first meeting of the broadcast school, or of the radio station, there were only 8 people there. And I was the only one interested in sports. And the next semester, I was the sports director. So, and then the state gave them a huge $100,000 grant. They built a brand new 50,000 full watt stereo radio station, which I happened to hit that right at the right time, and then interned at the local TV station. So that was a right move, transferring from Miami to Madison. You know, 7,500 kids there then. Now it's 22,000 at James Madison University. So it was a good move for me. Harrisonburg was a small area. But back in Arlington, yeah, that's the 3 schools: WNL, Wakefield, and Yorktown, and we were all rivals. And I'll tell you what, one of our great rivals was TC Williams. And I was there during the time when they made the movie Remember the Titans. Yeah. And we used to play TC all the time. And man, they had some great players, and we had some great players. We had some great, you know, running backs that were unbelievable. And they had some great running backs that were unbelievable. And just, we had a really cool rivalry. So when I got to see that movie, boy, it brought back some incredible memories.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a minute. But did you know a kicker named John Leipold that went to
Absolutely. He played for the Buffalo Bills. He passed away, but he was at WNL. I mean, so many guys that were there, you know, were tremendous athletes and went on to have great careers. But we had a lot of them, and a lot of you know, movie people as well. I mentioned Shirley MacLaine and Warren Beatty, Sandra Bullock, Forrest Tucker, who was on a show called F Troop, was there. The lady that was the only sane one in the Munsters, Marilyn somebody, she went to WNL. So we had a bunch of actors come out of there too. It was kind of neat. Yeah, it was a good school, and it's changed like 3 different times, but we had some great teachers and some legendary coaches.
Well, one thing that was interesting about Arlington sports, and Washington Lee in particular, and also Wakefield, is when the schools were desegregating in the 60s, and you mentioned Remember the Titans, and it kind of dramatizes the blending of 2 schools. Washington Lee was the first team to have an integrated team in the state tournament down in Charlottesville, and they actually won state. What was the racial horizon environment like when you were at Washington Lee? You were there, class of '73. So at that point, I guess you had several classes of integrated students.
Yeah, you know, it was interesting. It wasn't. I mean, there were obviously there were more whites than blacks, but there was a lot of black folks that went to WNL, and you know, I mean, I grew up with these guys, and they're all still good friends of mine. Some of them have passed on, but. And then some of the guys were on the football team as well. So our mixture on the football team obviously was more white than black, but we had several black players on our team that, I went from junior high school on up through high school with these guys, and they became dear friends. Some of them still are today, really. In fact, we had a guy on our basketball team. And it was interesting in junior high and high school, but junior high, I played with this fellow named Frankie Evans, who is a really good friend of mine. And he was clearly the best player on the team. I mean, you know, and I was this little white guy running around the gym, you know, and I couldn't jump, but I at least made the team. But I just remember our coach, Ed Wallowak, who was had been a great player at West Virginia University. He was our coach at Stratford Junior High School. And he used to say, just give the ball to Frankie and, let him do what he does.
Yeah.
And we did, because he was so good. And then when we went to high school, he started on the basketball team as well. And again, the ratio was clearly there were more white kids than black kids, but there were a number. And, it's funny. I just, maybe it sounds corny or whatever, but we didn't think a lot about race, then. These were your friends and guys you grew up with, and I don't know, maybe listen, I'm in a different, when you grow up and you're doing sports and you're dealing with teams, and even as a fan growing up, you don't see black and white that much. You just see guys. Like when I watch a basketball game, if there's 10 black players on the court, I don't see that. I just see guys on the court, and maybe sports is different than the rest of society in that regard, but at least for people like me that are so involved in the games, and even through high school, junior high and high school, you just see these guys as athletes, not necessarily color or what have you. So we had some great players. There was, the mixture it was clearly dominated by white kids, but we had a lot of black players, a lot of Hispanic. We had a lot of Hispanic players at my high school. Most of them gravitated toward the soccer team. That's the way that was. But we had a really good mixture of folks, and I still am friends with a lot of these guys.
What was the sports environment like in the city? Like, so you came of age in the 60s. So the Redskins had been bad for many generations, but Vince Lombardi came in 1970, and then George Allen and the Over the Hill gang. So Washington was going to become football crazy. The Senators had been on top for many years in terms of DC, and there was no basketball team here. The Bullets were still in Baltimore, and I guess they came here in '73 and became the Capitol Bullets. But what was the environment like in pro sports in the city?
Well, let me take you way back, just because you're right. The Bullets didn't come here until '67 when they went to Baltimore. Now I was 12, 13 years old. And my parents used to take me to the Civic Center to see them play. And that's where I developed my love for the Bullets. And at the time, my guys, Earl Monroe and Wes Unseld and Gus Johnson and Kevin Lockery and Jack Marin and these guys, that's who I rooted for. And when they played the Knicks, these were the greatest games I ever saw, when they had their guys. So that's where I developed my love for the Bullets. And then even back then, my father and my folks were native Washingtonians. When he was a kid and the Redskins played at Griffith Stadium at the time, which is now where Howard University Hospital is.
That's right.
He used to love to tell me this story. He managed to get a season ticket for a Redskin game, for the whole season. They played 6 home games. His season ticket, one ticket, cost $6.60. It was $1.10 a ticket per game.
Wow.
And he used to love to tell me that story. And I say, yeah, the prices are up a little bit now. And we've had season tickets. I don't know how long he had them then, but back since maybe 37, 38, he's had season tickets.
Wow.
And so I grew up going to DC Stadium, RFK Stadium, Section 519. That's where we go every Sunday. We take the bus down from Arlington to RFK to watch the team play. So back then, my memories were, you're right, the Redskins weren't very good, but they had Sonny Jurgensen, and they had Larry Brown, and they had Charlie Taylor, and they had Bobby Mitchell, and they had these great players. So at least, in my mind, I don't remember winning and losing as much as I do just the fact that these guys were so good and fun to watch, and had great rivalries with the Eagles and the Giants and the Cowboys. So I spent all my Sundays going to RFK Stadium to watch them play. When I was a little kid and the Senators were here, I remember my grandfather pulling me out of elementary school to go see opening day at DC Stadium to see the Senators play. And then, of course, they went away, and then we didn't get a team until the Nats came back. But those were my memories of that. Hockey, again, they didn't come here till late. And when they started, they weren't very good, which is an amazing story. It kind of tells you a little bit about Washington sports. For years, the Capitals had very little following. They couldn't put 10,000 people in that arena to watch them play. Now, of course, you can't get a ticket, and all the games are sold out. and people love to go see them play. And what it tells you, Julian, is that, as you know, if you give this city a winner, they'll go. You know, it doesn't matter what sport it is. I mean, for the Redskins, you couldn't get a season ticket. They were on a waiting list of like 80,000 people.
Yeah.
I tell people that now, they can't believe it. But, you know, you couldn't get a ticket and you had to get on a waiting list. The Bullets, obviously, I was fortunate to be able to cover them in their one and only world championship because I was at school at the time. So I was just getting ready to graduate James Madison. But I used to come up here regularly to go to the Capitol Center to watch them play, and was able to cover them when they won the world championship, which was one of the great joys of my life, seeing that.
Me too.
And so, you know, football, hockey, basketball, baseball, it's an interesting time here then. You know, we talk about Washington being a basketball city, which it is. I mean, we've had so many great players, as you know, come out of this town. If you give these folks, and even though it's a transient city, everybody's moving in and out of here from different places. If you give this city and these fans a winner, they'll go. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, look at when the Nats won the World Series a couple of years ago. People love to go there. Capitals, you can't get a ticket. When the Wizards are good, people go out. I mean, those years when Eddie Jordan was here and we made the playoffs 4 years in a row with Gilbert Arenas and those guys, that place was packed. But even back in the day when I covered the team at Capitol Center and Elvin Hayes and those guys, that was some of the most raucous fans I've ever seen in any city. Mm. And it's funny, Julian, I think back to those times, you saw the arena, there was a layer of haze, of smoke in the arena because you could smoke the arena back then. So the cigarette smoke would filter to the top and it would be there. And it was just bizarre to think about that kind of stuff. And then, of course, the football team, the Redskins at the time, you know, they've been legendary forever. Well, I say this now, and some of the younger generation starts to question me a little bit. I say they are and always will be the number one sport in this city. And I still believe that. But look, with what the Capitals have done and what the Nats did with the World Series and the demise of the football team over the last 2+ decades, you know, the brand that has been really tarnished. Maybe that's changing a little bit. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think so. I don't, you know, Snyder, I'm sure he tries hard, but he doesn't do himself any favors. I mean, his PR is terrible. And then the team, you know, they've made big moves, but none of the big moves ever seem to work out. So like, I feel like the effort is there, but it just, it doesn't translate into wins, and they don't make good economic decisions. I think what's going to happen is they may end up getting an arena, a stadium downtown, and maybe that'll give them a new life.
Yeah, I mean, it would be great if it were back in DC, somewhere there where they could, you know, we had, you know, the infrastructure is not great in DC, but they had a metro leading right up to the stadium, which was actually pretty good. It was a fairly easy place to get in and out of. Now, look, being a Northern Virginia guy, not only would I not have any problem with a stadium being in Northern Virginia, I completely understand it. You know, this is where their training facility is. You know, they train in Ashburn. The players all live out here. They only went to FedEx Field 8 times a year or 9 or 10 times a year. And that's it. You know, and of course, for people in Northern Virginia, that's on the complete opposite side of the Beltway. So my friends that all live in Maryland say to me, you know, we're not coming across that bridge to go to Virginia, and we don't like to do that. And we had, you know, that's a long way to go. Well, guess what? How long do you think it's been for people from Northern Virginia to go to FedEx Field every Sunday? That's a whole day's hike. And that stadium, as you know, is horrible to get in and out of. I mean, you could be there all night if you go to a Monday night game. So it would seem logical that they would put it in, you know, somewhere maybe out near Dulles if there's land to do that, or somewhere close to where Ashburn is, where the Redskin Park is. And I don't even know what they're calling that now.
Exactly.
Commander's Park? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, Steve, when did you start paying attention to play-by-play announcers and media and folks that were covering professional sports? Like I remember when I was a kid, I remember listening to Lindsey Nielsen on Notre Dame football on Saturday mornings, Sunday mornings actually, and then the NFL Today team, and then then there was the Howard Cosell kind of dominated the media in the 70s when NFL became king. So when did you start paying attention to those guys?
I started really getting interested in just broadcasters in general. Like I say, when I was in high school, I used to watch the news religiously here.
Mhm.
I don't know why, but I loved watching the news anchors and the sports people. And so, I grew up with Warner Wolf on TV. He's the guy that started everything that you see today, Julian. I mean, if you know, you watch some of these guys on ESPN and what have you, in some way, shape, or form, they're doing Warner Wolf. I mean, Chris Berman is a Warner Wolf clone. He watched Warner Wolf when Warner went from here to up to New York and then came back again. But Warner really, and a guy named Vince Bagley over in Baltimore, really kind of started that whole, hey, stop it, get out of here, boo, that kind of thing. Warner started all of that. And then sportscasters sort of saw that and got hip to it. Chris Berman was the great example, but in some way, shape, or form, all these guys today are doing what Warner Wolf started. So those are the guys I watched, and I watched religiously on TV, locally. Channel 4 had an anchor named Glenn Rinker who was there forever, and I remember him and all the old sports guys back in the day. So that, when I went to college, I wanted to major in communications. And that's, watching those guys is I remember, again, when I was growing up, the greatest, my favorite Bullets announcer, who also has passed away, who was great, was Jim Carvelis.
Yeah, Jim Carvelis.
Jim actually went up and eventually became the Knicks play-by-play guy. He was so good, and his voice to me is synonymous with the Bullets. When Earl Monroe, I would remember him calling him a whirling dervish, and he would say bullseye, when a guy would hit a shot. Jim Carvelis was so good and so smooth, and I met him a few times, was just such a nice guy. Man, he was good. And then radio play-by-play, Tony Roberts, who did Notre Dame football forever, but Tony did the Bullets locally. Great play-by-play guy, also a nice man, and I love the guy. And then obviously after that, Frank Herzog became radio play-by-play, and then Mel Proctor. Years did, and Mel was such a good man. We were blessed to have some great play-by-play guys in this town. Frank obviously doing the football team, but also the Bullets. In fact, for my money, Frank owns the two best calls in the history of Washington sports. When the Bullets won the championship in 77, 78, he made that call about the fat lady and all of that.
Oh, that's right.
And then when Riggins broke that run against the Dolphins, I can hear it to this day. He's gone. To me now, look, we've had some great calls when the Nats won the World Series. Charlie Slows had a great call on the radio, and Dave Jagler and those guys. But Frank had those two best calls. So that's when I got interested in that, Julian. And then when I went to college and actually transferred to Madison, and I can remember even back in the day, I used to have, this sounds so corny because, God, you hear ancient people talking about stuff like this, but I used to have my transistor radio, and I would tune it into different play-by-play guys that you could get, locally and sometimes on a clear channel. And I remember listening, my favorite radio play-by-play guy for the NBA, along with Tony Roberts, was a guy named Joe Tate, who did the Cleveland Cavaliers. And he was on 3WE, WWWE Cleveland, which was 1100 on the AM dial. And you could hear it in what they used to say, 38 states and half of Canada. So you could pick it up, and you probably still can.
That's awesome.
I used to tune that in to listen to Joe Tate, who I just thought was the greatest play-by-play guy. I got to meet him several times because he still did the games when I did the Wizards, and then he passed away. But that's when I got interested in that, Julian, and knew when I went to college that's what I wanted to do, and was lucky to be able to do radio. I did the color commentary for Madison basketball, James Madison basketball, for 4 years. There was an opening for the color commentator, not the play-by-play guy, because they wanted the play-by-play guy to be a professional, and I was a student. Mm-hmm. So I learned under two guys there, and including my mentor, Tom Delaney. But to get that color job, I took a reel-to-reel tape recorder, this big reel-to-reel tape recorder, which I still have, and I got a press pass and went up to a Bullets game at the Capitol Center, and I sat at the press table, and I did the play-by-play into this big reel-to-reel tape recorder. brought it back, gave it to our sports information director at Madison College, a guy named Rich Murray, and got the job doing the color, which I did for 4 years at Madison. I think they paid me $20 a game, and got to travel all around the country to, with the team.
That's
and
cool.
saw some great players. We had great players at JMU. We made the tournament many times under Coach Lou Campanelli. The first year I got there, one of our assistant coaches was Mike Fratello. So, I mean, we had some good coaches. We had some good players. A guy named Sherman Dillard was one of our greatest players.
Good coach too.
And George Tolliver, who went on to be an NBA referee. I know George well, and we used to referee together. So that's how I got interested in that, and was able to move from radio into TV in Harrisonburg at the local ABC station. And that's where I got my start.
Well, before we get back to Madison, there's two other DC personalities that I think had an impact, not necessarily on play-by-play, but was Ken Beatrice.
Yes.
Really started the sports talky thing,
Yep.
at least that I know of. And then Glenn Brenner, because Warner Wolf had the Boo of the Week, and he was definitely had personality, but Glenn Brenner just brought humor to sports. I'm not sure nationally he was well known, but he was an amazing sports personality in DC. Can you talk about those two guys too?
Yeah, well, first of all, Ken Beatrice, you're right. He was probably the originator of sports talk radio, and was amazing, had a great mind, and was a really interesting guy. Those of us who knew him well, he had some real idiosyncrasies, but he was a good dude, and everybody loved to listen to him. You're next on Sports Call. Thanks so much for the call. Yeah. And we'd listen to him all the time. When I first started in TV, which was in 1977 in Harrisonburg, I had come up to Washington to cover a Bullets game. And that's the first time I met Glenn Brenner. And he had just started at Channel 9. And he was so nice to me, and we became friends, and I stayed in contact with him. And every time I would make a move in TV, from Harrisonburg to my next job, which was in Chattanooga, Tennessee, to my next job, which was in Nashville, Tennessee, to my next job, which was in Atlanta, Georgia, and then eventually Washington, I would call Glenn and say, hey, what do you think about this move? Because I had some trepidation on some of those moves. And he would always clarify it for me. And I would watch him. And I had one of the very first video tape recorders that I had, and it was a Quasar machine. This was before Beta or VHS or any of that. And my mother had one in DC, and she used to tape Glenn Brenner's sportscasts and send them to me wherever I was, whether it was Harrisonburg, Chattanooga, Nashville, Atlanta, so that I could play them. Because back then you couldn't just tune somebody in, and you didn't have there was no internet or any of that. You couldn't see these guys. So that's how I'd be able to see Glenn do sports. And I loved him. He was unbelievable. So when I got to Washington in 1984, and I started doing weekends at Channel 5, and then eventually I was the weekday sports guy, I was competing against and on the air with Glenn Brenner, Frank Herzog at Channel 7, and George Michael at Channel 4.
Wow.
Now you're talking about three of the best sportscasters in the country. George Michael, who obviously had the sports machine, was an unbelievable showman. He was the best at what he did with video, and he had all kinds of people, interns and people with satellites that were getting the very best video that he could get. And he would put that on TV, and that's what made him famous and obviously nationally known, that sports machine show. He was as good a talent as I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. Glenn Brenner was the funniest dude I've ever known and the best sportscaster. And he wasn't even the quintessential sportscaster. I mean, that was a title, but what he was just an entertainer. Okay. He was a down-to-earth, genuine, comically gifted broadcaster. Okay. That's a better way to describe him than a sportscaster. Yeah. And we all knew that, and we all saw that. He was the funniest dude. And I'll tell you what, Julian, if you ever knew him personally, and obviously he's passed away, and that was tragic, but we were all, we were competitors, but when you get to this market, you got to be pretty good at what you do. So really, we all had the access to pretty much the same stories. It was basically how you presented them on the air that made you unique or different. George had his way. Glenn had his way. I like to think I had my way. Frank had his way, and all the weekend guys. that were all so very good at what they did in this market. But you all had the same stories. The only way you bested another guy was if maybe you broke a story that nobody else had. And I was able to do that a couple of times. But Glenn was funnier off camera than he was on camera. Like we'd go out to Skins training camp in Carlisle, and we'd all be there for like 2 weeks covering this team. So when they go out onto the field to practice, we all stood on the tarmac right around where the trainer's entrance was, where Bubba Tyer was. And we'd stand there and we'd tell jokes. And Glenn would have you literally almost on the concrete laughing. I mean, the funniest guy I've ever seen. He just, but you're right. People gravitated toward watching him because here's the thing, Julian, every news director I've ever had, and I've had many of them. Hell, at Channel 5, I had, in 14 years, I think I had 13 news directors. They would come and go like you can't believe. Every single one of them used to say to us being guys in the sports department, they'd say, listen, only 25% of the people that watch news are interested in sports. The other 75% don't care, and they want to see the weather and whatever else we have. And those statistics back in the day were fairly correct. Now, they may still be correct today because your local news, hell, half the stations in DC don't even have a sports department anymore. I know Channel 5 doesn't. Channel 4 doesn't anymore. They'll sneak some in when they want to, but during the pandemic, they got rid of sports. Everybody did. 9 and 7 still have sports. So they would tell us that only 25% of the people that watch the news are interested in sports. Glenn Brenner attracted the 75% that couldn't care less. And if you have that, that's the goose that laid the golden egg, man. That's the rainbow right there. And had he, who knows whether he'd be retired by now or, had he still been alive and gone through some of these other years, he'd have been untouchable, and he would have been making a couple $1 million a year at that TV station because he was worth that much. He attracted all of those people that turned it off for sports. He everybody knew him and they loved him. So to your point, he was the best I ever saw. And everybody loved the guy, man. And he was just so funny and witty. He was amazing. Him and Gordon Peterson together were the best, I thought. And then obviously George and Jim Vance were great too. And, there's Channel 4 is the one station that still has, I'll tell you what happened. After Glenn died, George went to the people at Channel 4 and said, listen, we got this market now. We need to promote and tell people that we're the best, which is what TV stations do. And they did, to their credit. And they took the market by storm and they became the station in this market. And I believe they still are. And Doreen Gensler, who's been there forever, I worked with her in Chattanooga. I watched her do her audition tape when she came out of the University of Georgia. And that was her first job in Chattanooga. So it's a small business. It goes, everybody knows everybody else. But yeah, Glenn was a force at Channel 9, along with Gordon Peterson and Maureen Bunyan and Gordon Barnes, and then eventually Max Robinson. That was a great TV station.
Yeah. Well, talk a little bit about how the industry changed in terms of getting your start. Like nowadays, covering sports and the whole sports industry is so exposed. So many young people want to do it. And they pursue these jobs. They almost have to work for free. Back when you were getting started, after you graduated from Madison, the market was just evolving. It was just ESPN was probably a year or two away from
started yet.
Hadn't
started yet,
which changed everything. So talk about how it's different to getting a start now than it was in your day.
Totally different, Julian. I mean, leaps and bounds. First of all, like you said, there was no internet, so you couldn't do anything. There was no ESPN. There was no CNN. There was none of that stuff. There was no Fox Sports, any of that. Back in those days, when you tried to get a job in sports, the only way to do it was to look in the back of the industry broadcast magazine, which was called Broadcasting Magazine. They printed it down on DeSales Street off Connecticut Avenue, over where ABC is. That was the only way to get a job. You looked in the back of Broadcast Magazine, and it would say, it would have the jobs listed. That's how I got my job in Chattanooga, which was my second job. It said Sunbelt Station. We're looking for news, weather, and sports to join the news team. And I'm thinking, wow, Sunbelt Station, that's awesome. I figured it was in Florida somewhere. I didn't realize it was Chattanooga, Tennessee till I got there. But at any rate, that's where I got my second job in TV. But what you used to do back then was, remember, there were no other outlets. Like I said, ESPN didn't exist. There were no TV talk shows going on. There was none of that stuff. When you applied for a job as a TV sportscaster, you had usually 3 stations in each market. In DC, you had 4 because of Channel 5. And at each station, there were 2 sports guys. There was the weekday guy and the weekend guy. And that was it. There were no other jobs available. Football teams didn't have sideline reporters. They didn't do, when you try to get a job as a sportscaster, you had 3 stations in each market and 2 jobs at each station. And you probably, if you were young like me and you're trying to get a job, you probably weren't going to get the weekday job because that was a guy that had been, was already there. You're probably going to get the weekend job. So you would send out these 3/4-inch tapes, which is what we had back then. You would put a reel together of yourself, and you would take it to the post office with a cover letter, and you would send it somewhere. And I probably sent out 50 to 75 tapes when I was in the course of my career. And I may have gotten 10 of them back. You knew when you were sending out a tape, you probably weren't going to get it back. I was thrilled sometimes just to get the tape back with a rejection letter. I'm serious. If I just got somebody that was interested enough to respond to me and say, we don't have any openings, I was thrilled to get that. So when I finally got, my second job in TV after Harrisonburg in Chattanooga, and they flew me down there to interview me and what have you, you can imagine I was thrilled because I was going from Harrisonburg, Virginia, which was the 196th market in the country out of about 212, to a real city, Chattanooga, Tennessee, even though at the time it wasn't, exactly a beautiful place. They've since redone the whole town and it's nice now. And I went to a TV station that wasn't great, but it was a legitimate NBC station. In fact, as irony would have it, the call letters were WRCB. So I used to pretend like I was at Channel 4 at WRC. And I did my stint there, which was for 1 year and 5 months, got a job in Nashville, was in Nashville for only 10 months, and then got a job in Atlanta at what was the best TV station in all of the South, WSB TV. Worked with some great folks, including Ernie Johnson Jr., who's a very good friend of mine, and then got my job up in DC. So back in the day, you had just a few opportunities to get a job at a TV station. In Washington, 4 stations, each station had 2 sports guys. That was it. So you had to try to get one of those jobs, and it wasn't easy. And I tell kids nowadays, the good news about today is that there are thousands of jobs around the country that are available. Back in my day, there were, a few hundred. And that's the good news. The bad news is it's more competitive now than it's ever been. Everybody wants to do it, Everybody wants to be on TV or be a journalist or a reporter or a sportscaster or what have you. So it has changed dramatically, as you said. It's drastically changed to where back in the day, there were just a few jobs open to today where, broadcasting and communications, whether it's on TV or digital or whatever it happens to be, there's a lot of opportunities. It's just still tough to get jobs.
Well, one of the first big stories that you covered was the Len Bias overdose. And Len Bias was, as you know, obviously he's an All-American basketball player at the University of Maryland. He had just got drafted by the Celtics, and many thought he was going to be the heir apparent to Larry Bird and, just to have a Hall of Fame career. And there was no reason to believe he wouldn't. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that episode?
Well, it's a day that I'll never forget, Julian, because it was my birthday. He died on June 19th, 1986, which is my birthday, and I happened to have the day off, and I was playing in a golf tournament in Maryland and got the word fairly early on that a tragedy had occurred and he had died. And they told me to come back to the TV station because everybody was going to be on the air doing these stories. So I did. I went back to Channel 5 and we did a big story. Yeah, that was a tragic day in DC history. I remember how everybody covered the story and how little by little you started hearing bits and pieces about it, and who was around, who was involved, what actually happened, what did Lefty Drizel have to do with any of this, and it was just a horrible, horrible day. And it's interesting because we had a show at Channel 5 called Sports Extra every Sunday night. All the TV stations have some kind of sports final or sports plus, whatever you want to call them. Ours was called Sports Extra on a Sunday night live. And the Sunday before Len Bias died, he was on our Sports Extra show. He was at the TV station at Channel 5, and I was interviewing him. In fact, if you watch the 30 for 30 on Len Bias, they use a clip that we had where I asked him about now going to be a NBA star. You have so much time on your hands. What do you do? And so many guys have been involved in, drugs for one thing, and some other, off the court activities. And he commented on all those things, and they used it in that 30 for 30 piece. So he was at our station just 4 days before he passed away, which was, we still can't believe it to this day. We have this full life-size poster of him that we had on the door of the sports office that he signed, which was so cool. And he was such a good guy. I eventually got to know his mom because we went into the DC Sports Hall of Fame. She was there with, accepting the award for him, and saw her and knew the family. And it was a horrible day. And you're right. He would have been the heir apparent. He would have, I don't know what he would have done with that franchise, but by most observers and most experts, he would have been a key player on that team and probably led them to some competitive final in some way. He was an unbelievable player, and he was a nice dude. He just, I was watching some video the other day of Lefty when he announced his retirement, and he just said, "I love Leonard Bias. I always will. He made a mistake, and he died because of it." Because I don't think he did drugs. Most people I talked to, didn't know him as somebody that did that kind of thing. I guess he did it once, and tragically it cost him his life.
Yeah, it's very sad what happened to Lefty Drizel also. He had to end up stepping down. Yeah, so I know also you covered some football, and you went to some Super Bowls and covered those games as well. Which Super Bowls did you go to and cover?
I covered the one in 1988 in San Diego, which was the Doug Williams game.
Oh, that's great.
Which was unbelievable. And that was awesome, 1988. And they played the Denver Broncos. And then I covered the Super Bowl in 1991 in Minneapolis when they played Buffalo. Remember both of them very well. Jack Murphy Stadium in San Diego. Doug came in, and had that unbelievable second quarter with a guy named Timmy Smith, who rushed for, I think, 226 yards. And, at the time was a record, might be still, I don't know. But after going down 10-0 to John Elway and the Broncos, they came back and they just creamed them. All those passes to Ricky Sanders and Gary Clark and those guys and Art. It was a fabulous win and just an amazing victory. And then in 1991, you're in Minneapolis, which is not a great place to have a Super Bowl, Julian, because it's really cold in the winter there. It's the coldest city I've ever been in my life, traveling around with the Wizards and even with the Redskins back in that day. We were there for like 10 days, and all the TV stations sent all their crew there. Channel 4 had like 25 people there. Channel 9 had like 21 people there. Channel 7 had like 18 people there. Little Channel 5, we had like 9 people there. But we all did our broadcasts live every night, from Minneapolis, just like we did in San Diego. And, Minneapolis was so cold. If you weren't into ice carving or ice fishing, it was not a great place to be. Now, thank God for those walkways they have there, because you have to use those. You freeze. When you went outside, your nostrils froze. But, that was the season, Julian, when I had this infamous run-in with Joe Gibbs, the head coach. In the preseason before that season started, 91, 90, 91, whatever it was, or 91, 92, actually. The Redskins weren't very good in the preseason. I want to say they finished 1-3. And we at Channel 5 Fox had not gotten football yet. We were a Fox station, which we became in 87 or 88, but Fox didn't get the NFL till 1994. So Channel 5 broadcast the preseason games, all the Redskin preseason games. And we did them all. Obviously, we'd have pre and post game shows. And so I was in the booth before the game with Jack Kent Cooke, the owner, interviewing him to ask him about the team. And we did it live. And our director was a famous guy, great friend of mine named Ernie Bauer, who directed Glenn Brenner and Warner Wolf at Channel 9 and then was at Channel 5. So we did this live interview with Mr. Cooke, and I asked him about the team, and he said, Steve, this is the best bloody damn team we've ever had. I fully expect them to go to the Super Bowl and win the Super Bowl. Okay, great. So now the game is played. They lose in overtime, I think, to Cleveland. And now I'm in the locker room with Joe Gibbs afterwards live. And I said, Coach, with 2 weeks to go to the regular season, this team is really spotty, and they haven't played very well in the preseason. If I were the head coach, I'd be concerned at this point, especially with everybody saying, how great this team is. And I said, and a lot of people predicting this team to win this, to go to the Super Bowl. And he says, well, who said that? Now, dumbass me, instead of remembering that I had just interviewed the owner who said, I fully expect them to go to the Super Bowl, me, who the night before had been reading Playboy's pigskin previews, which at the time was a very legitimate thing. They picked and I didn't look at the pictures, Julian, but I was reading the articles, and it had the Redskins picked to go to the Super Bowl. I say to Joe Gibbs live on TV, well, Playboy picked you to go to the Super Bowl. That was a huge mistake. I mean, here is this God-fearing man who jumped on me like you can't believe. Yeah. And Playboy picking football. And he went off, man, and he said that, we haven't won a division title around here in 5 years, and, I don't think we're that good. And if anybody wants to say that, he says, I'm not taking that as a knock on our team, but that's the way I feel about it, Steve. And I said, gotcha. Fast forward 6 months, they go to the Super Bowl in Minneapolis. I get Coach Gibbs on camera. I say, Coach, I don't want to sit here and say I told you so. He said, you're right. You're right. They were right. Playboy was right. I'll never question that again. And they win the Super Bowl. So covering those teams, Julian, I tell people, especially young people today, that have no inkling of how this team used to be. I tell them that those were the glory years, obviously. That was the best offensive line in the history of this franchise. That's when that team was number one. You couldn't get a ticket. You had 3 different quarterbacks win Super Bowls under Joe Gibbs, Joe Theismann, Mark Rippon, Doug Williams. And those were the glory years of this team and this franchise. A once proud franchise with a brand that was in the top 5 in all the sports in the world. And so I was fortunate to cover that and to cover Joe Gibbs and all those great coaches that we had here and all those great players. And I'm still friends, very good friends with lots of those players. Jeff Bostic is a close friend of mine, Joe Jacoby, Donnie Warren, Mark Rippon. I mean, you could just go down the list, Curtis Jordan, all these guys that I know, Babe Laufenberg, and stay in touch with. They're all really good friends. And that's the great thing about this business, Julian, is that when it's all said and done and those guys are retired and you're not broadcasting anymore, you still have these relationships, and you cherish those relationships. And they were interesting at the time because sometimes they were adversarial because you're a reporter, they're a player, but now they're great. Now they're just friendly. It's awesome.
I felt like the city, and it sounds like reporters, had such a close relationship with those players. I remember I couldn't wait the Redskins sidelines would come on. They would just get up there and they would just yap it up. And I really felt like they were really part of the city. They weren't just football players who were making, millions and millions of dollars. Not that I begrudge the amount of money they make, but it seemed like a different time.
Yeah. It was interesting because I remember watching Redskins sidelines with Glenn and he'd have Sonny on, and then even George's show, which I think was called Redskin Report, and our show, which we had a show called Redskins Playbook. And it would come on every Monday night at 7:00 live from the studio. It was a great show because it was on, basically 24 hours after the game was over. So it was still fresh in everybody's mind. It was live. And our show was such that we'd have 2 journalists and a player. So we'd have at any given time, Tony Kornheiser, Michael Wilbon, Lenny Shapiro, David Aldridge, Mo Siegel, these great journalists that were here, and then a player. And we would, listen, a lot of times you would have to pay these players to come on your shows to make sure they'd be there. Now, we didn't pay the players, but we did give them stuff. We would give them, well, first of all, we'd send a limo to pick them up, to bring them to the station. We'd give them a gift certificate for like a free pair of boots or maybe a free pair of sunglasses or something like that. That was enticement enough, at least on my show, for them to come down. I'd like to think a lot of it had to do with the relationship I had with these guys. They liked me, I liked them. And so they would come down and be on our show. And that was awesome to sit in there and do that. Glenn had the same thing. George had the same thing. But it's interesting because Warner Wolf, when he came back to Washington after his stint in New York, he refused to pay players. He wouldn't do that because he just felt that, it was against his principles to have to pay guys to come on the air. And I agree with that. I see his point. I agree wholeheartedly. The problem is if you asked a guy to come on and you didn't pay him, there's a chance that that seat would be empty when he promised to be there on a Tuesday when they were all off. So Glenn used to pay him. They paid him a lot of money. They paid him like $1,200 to come be on the show for 10 minutes on a Tuesday, their day off. And George paid them obviously as well. Now, George had specific guys. He had the coach and he had usually the star quarterback under contract, and they would be making like 50 grand. I mean, this is a lot of money back then, still is. So you had to secure these guys to make sure they came. But yeah, the relationship back then, I don't know, it didn't seem to be as adversarial. Now, look, I asked guys questions and I wasn't afraid to ask questions. I got into it once with Mark Rippon and he stomped away. He left an interview with me because he got mad because I asked him at what point should a coach pull a quarterback out of a game after he had a bad game against the Giants. But then we cleared it all up and, we're still friends to this day. So now look, I'm not out there covering the team. So I think the beat writers are probably, have a relationship, but look, these guys don't stay here as long as they did back then. So back then you saw guys every year and they were the same dudes, they never left. I think Art Monk was the first guy to leave. So the relationships back then, I think, were different.
By the way, the check's in the mail for this podcast for you. So
right. I'm happy to do it for free, man.
Well, thank you. This is great. So Steve, why don't we talk a little bit about getting the opportunity with the Wizards and becoming a play-by-play guy?
My whole career, Julian, I did play-by-play at all these different stations. And they were really, I think back to some of these, I started actually in Harrisonburg. I did high school football play-by-play on the radio. Then I would come back to the station and anchor the 11 o'clock sports. I did spot games here and there when I was in Chattanooga. When I went to Nashville, I did a Tennessee State University game, and my color commentator was Sam Jones. Okay, and I got to know Sam really well, and what a great fella he was. And then obviously doing spot stuff all along the way until I got to Washington. When I got to Channel 5, we were the Big East station. Channel 5 televised all the Georgetown games. And so I got involved there with doing play-by-play on TV, and I did a lot of Georgetown games and then did a lot of Big East games. So that was really my first opportunity to do that a lot. And because I was at Channel 5, they allowed me to do those games. And then in 1994, when Fox got the NFL, which is an amazing story, Channel 5 for years was owned by a man named John Kluge, who was one of the richest men in the country, owned a company called Metro Media. That's what Channel 5 used to be called, Metro Media Television. And there were 6 Metro Media stations around the country: Washington, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, all the big markets, and Kluge owned these stations until around 1987, when he sold those 6 TV stations to a man named Rupert Murdoch, who is the head of Fox Television.
Mhm.
And he sold those stations for $2.3 billion. And those 6 TV stations became the Fox Television Network.
Wow.
Now, at the time in 1987, 88, they had very little programming. They had The Simpsons. They had In Living Color.
Yeah.
They might have had a movie of a week that was on Fox, but they didn't have anything. And so because of that, there weren't a lot of Fox affiliates around the country. There were these 6 fledgling TV stations that were trying to make a name for themselves. That all changed. It changed the course of television sports as we know it in 1994, when Fox outbid CBS for the rights to the NFL, specifically the NFC. CBS forever and ever was the Redskins station, Channel 9. Fox outbid them for that in 94. And overnight, Fox went into the sports broadcasting business. Overnight. They went from having no sports to having the NFL overnight. So what they did was they hired away all the guys from CBS, the great directors, Sandy Grossman, the great producers, Bob Stenner, these guys that had been at CBS forever now had come to Fox. Ed Goren was the head of Fox Sports. And so they took over, and overnight we went from being the preseason Redskins station to carrying the Redskins on TV, which was huge. I mean, and the way Fox broadcast the games originally back then, with obviously the pregame show with Bradshaw and JB and Howie Long and those guys, that their whole production of that was different than anything we'd ever seen. They introduced David Hill, who's the president of Fox Sports, was, Australian like Rupert Murdoch. They introduced all the things we see on TV today that we never saw before. The little bug up in the corner that has the time remaining and the down and distance and the timeouts and all that, that was never anywhere. In fact, when they first put that on, people, you ready for this? You think about what's on Bloomberg TV today with all the crawls all over the screen and everywhere. When they first put that on there, people were like, get that off. It's distracting. I can't see the game. Well, people got used to it and expected to see it, to the point where NBC was forced to put it on because Fox had it on. At first, NBC would only put it on third downs, and then they take it off. And then Fox was like, would have it up, and people got used to it. So NBC was like, okay, we need to put that thing up there all the time. The yellow line, the first down line, that was a Fox innovation.
Didn't know that.
It wasn't, at first, it wasn't on all the games, wasn't on any college games. And it was only on the 4:00 national broadcast on Fox Sports because it was expensive. It was like $50,000 to put that thing in there electronically.
Is that right?
Well, it became so popular that people were like, okay, I got to know where the first down marker is. So now it became visible on every broadcast, 1:00 and 4:00, and all the other networks had to have it. And now all college games had to have it. So things like that, the swooshes coming in and out, the sound effects, Fox has the robot, and all those things were Fox innovations, and they changed the way that we watch sports. If you go back and watch an old game, you see these old archaic graphics and, stuff that's so old. The stuff you see today with the camera on the wire and all the flying stuff, and Fox changed the way we watch sports. They are to be credited for all of that. And then all the networks eventually copied that. So in 1994, I was working at Channel 5 and I sent a tape to Fox Sports, and they brought me out to Los Angeles to audition to do play-by-play for the NFL on Fox. And that first year I got some games. For 3 years, I got some Fox games. My first game was a Redskin game, Redskins at Tampa Bay, in a game where Brian Mitchell in the opening kickoff was knocked unconscious by a guy named Terrell Buckley, who hit him under the chin. And Brian went out of the game and eventually came back in. This was before any concussion protocol. So I go out to do my audition tape at Fox. And here are the guys that I'm doing that are out there auditioning with me. There was only 5 other guys. Joe Buck, Kenny Albert, Tom Brenneman, Kevin Harlan, and a guy named Craig Bolerjack. All right, so Joe Buck is Jack Buck's son. Kenny Albert is Marv Albert's son. Tom Brenneman is Brenneman's son, who did the St. Louis Cardinals forever. And Kevin Harlan was his father was the president of the Green Bay Packers.
Wow.
And here I am. Okay, I got home and my father says to me, "Damn, I'm sorry, I'm in the building business. You know, here I am with all these legendary sons." And we all got games. I don't think Craig did, but all these other guys, and they're still doing them, except for Tom Brenneman, who obviously lost his job. And so I got some games. And so because of that play-by-play experience, and then what happened was the way I got the Wizards game, the Bullets games, in 1996, Mel Proctor, who had been doing their games, left to do San Diego Padres baseball. And I had filled in for him a lot. And I was very good friends, had a good relationship with Susan O'Malley, who was the president of the Bullets, and Abe Poland owned the team. So they had me and Dave Johnson finish out the rest of that season, about 20 games, alternating and doing the play-by-play, and Channel 5 let me do that. So that in 1997, which was the last year they had been in the playoffs before they made it again, you know, back in this era, they played Chicago, and Michael was in Chicago with Scottie Pippen and those guys. And we had Chris Webber and Juwan Howard, and lost in a 3-game series to them 0-3. But if you remember, after the series, Michael Jordan came out and said, "Hey, that Bullets team is going to be really good." Well, I did one of those games with Phil Chenier, and I knew that the next season they were going to be looking for a play-by-play guy. So I went to Susan O'Malley and I just said, "Look, I'd like to do the play-by-play next year, full time. And I'm prepared to leave Channel 5 if I have to." She said, because she said to me, "Well, we're going to need you here in November during rating period, and we're going to need you here in May if we make the playoffs. So you can't come to me and say, 'Hey, Channel 5 won't let me do the games.' You have to be able to commit." And I said, "I'm prepared to commit and leave 5 if I have to." Well, lo and behold, Channel 5 didn't want me doing their game, you know, being gone all the time. So I left Channel 5. A lot of people thought I was fired or whatever, but that was my own choice. And I left 5 to go do the Wizards. You know, and this is back in the day too, Julian, when you never saw talent on anybody else's station. You know, like you would never see James Brown on Fox and then on HBO, you know, doing what he does or what have you. So back then, the people that were headed up Channel 5 said to me, "You know, you're going to be doing games on some other network, and we don't really want to see that, and we don't want you gone." And I said, "Look, your sports director, me, is going to be doing games for the new team," because we knew they were going to be changing. They were still the Bullets, but they were going to be called the Wizards, in a new arena downtown with new uniforms and a whole new brand. And oh, by the way, in 3 years, with the greatest player who ever played basketball. We didn't know that at the time, that Michael Jordan was going to, but you see how they couldn't see the forest for the trees. They didn't want their sports guy gone a few nights a week. Whereas it could have been I think a boon for them. You know, it could have been, Marv Albert did that in New York. He would go do a Rangers game or a Knicks game, then go back to and do, the sports on WNBC. So it could have been done, but they didn't want that. And so I left. And that's how I got the job to do the Wizards. And my first year was in 97. And then the very next year, there was a lockout. And I got paid by the game. I didn't have that kind of a contract. So when you hear about these lockouts affecting all these peripheral, entities like concessions people and parking people and all that stuff, it affects some of the broadcasters too. I lost a tremendous amount of money because the players were locked out, and we only did 50 games that year. I lost 32 games. That was, my second year. And I'm like, all right, I'm not getting paid what I thought I was, but, I still, made money and was able to live. But but I lost it too. So those lockouts affect everybody. But that's how I got my Wizards job, my Bullets and then Wizards, and with Phil Chenier, and did that for 22 years.
So when you call play by play, how do you know how much to talk? I mean, you're describing a game. Football and basketball, they're different tempos, I assume. Does it take a while to learn when you should talk and when you should let your partner in and those kind of things?
Yeah, there's an art to it, and obviously radio is different than TV.
Mm-hmm.
Radio is actually more enjoyable for me to do than TV. I did a lot of radio play-by-play because you have to paint the picture when you do radio play-by-play. You have to create the atmosphere for everybody listening. TV, they're already seeing it. You don't have to do any of that. You just guide the broadcast along. The skill in doing that, I think, is to learn how to inject not only information and statistics, but stories about the players, and obviously including your expert analyst, your color commentator, as we call them, and incorporating all of those things into a game. You don't have to. I told you, if you went back and watched TV years ago, you'd hear the TV play-by-play guy calling it almost like a radio broadcast. We don't do that anymore. Now you hear stories being told and sideline reporters telling stories while the action is happening, because you see the action. It doesn't need to be called play-by-play every play. You want to occasionally say who's got the ball, and obviously if there's a score, and give the score and build it into a dramatic finish, which to me, that's where the real skill in doing play-by-play is. You don't want to scream and yell in the first 5 minutes of the broadcast. You let it build so that it comes to a climax. So at the end of the game, if it's a close game and there's a game winner, then you can, scream out, my signature call was Dagger if they won, or whatever it happens to be. But you can do all those things and you let it build to a climax. There's only one sport, which is really interesting. And I've had this discussion before with my friend Joe Beninati. There's only one sport where TV play-by-play is called like radio play-by-play, and that's ice hockey. If you think about listening to an ice hockey game, they basically call, unless they're involved in a conversation with the color commentator, they basically call every pass, every shot, every switch, every certain thing. And it's the only sport that I can think of where there's virtually only one way to call a score. And that's by saying, he scores, he shoots, he scores, he fires, he scores. That's the only way to call a hockey goal. Now, we did have a guy here years ago that did the Capitals who would say, shot and a goal. I think it was Mike Forens who did that, play-by-play guy. But other than that, if you listen to a hockey game, that's the only way to call it, whereas in basketball, there's a million different ways to call a field goal. He shoots, he makes it, it's good, Dagger, this, that, and the other thing. There's only one way to call a hockey goal. Shoots, he scores. That's it. I always found that to be really interesting. But the play-by-play for TV is a talent, and you need to incorporate, obviously, your color commentator. You have to set them up, to tell stories, to tell the action. And, it's kind of a unique skill. And all of my counterparts that do it in the NBA, I think they're really, really good. And they're all, first of all, it's a close business. We're all friends. They're all good. We still talk today, whether it's Mike Breen in New York, or Mike Gorman in Boston, or Joel Myers in New Orleans, or Eric Reed in Miami, Bob Rathman in Atlanta. These guys are all really talented play-by-play guys who are really good at what they do.
Who's been the most influential in your style, in your play-by-play style?
It goes way back to when I was first getting started, and the most influentials would have been Joe Tate, who did the Cleveland radio play-by-play, and Skip Carey, who did the Atlanta Braves baseball and Hawks basketball, son of Harry Carey, Skip Carey, whose son now does play-by-play. But when I got to Atlanta, Skip was doing the Hawks and the Braves. So the Braves games were Skip Carey, Pete Van Wieren, Ernie Johnson Sr., Ernie's father, who was great, and a guy named John Sterling, who went on to do Yankees baseball and is legendary in New York. These guys were all in Atlanta. And Skip, to me, watching him do Hawks basketball, had probably the greatest influence, along with the fellow that I mentioned before, my mentor when I first got into play-by-play, a fellow named Tom Delaney down in Harrisonburg, Virginia, who was one of the great broadcasters I've ever known and is a very dear friend. He was a great broadcaster, and I learned from him. Even though I did color, he did play-by-play. I learned how to broadcast really from him and how to do play-by-play. And then these other guys had an influence on me. And then you develop your own style, Julian. That's really what you want to do.
You guys are like funeral directors. It's all like in the family. You know, it's always.
Oh my God. It's a very close-knit fraternity. So listen, when I left the Wizards, which was unceremoniously, I got a call when that became public. I got a call that day from Charles Barkley, who I know through Ernie Johnson because Ernie's a dear friend. So whenever we go to play the Hawks, I go over to the TNT set and hang out with those guys for 4 hours. Barkley called me to ask me, what the hell's going on and what happened. Mike Breen called me that night. I mean, it's a fraternity. All these guys, they all contacted me just like I would contact them for something. We'd go over stuff together. Bill Walton used to call me before ESPN did a game when he was doing their games, and he would be on the set and he'd be in a roundtable discussion. He called me to talk about the Wizards for 45 minutes. The reason he did that was because he knew that the local broadcasters knew more about the team than anybody else. And so for him to get a good handle on the team, it was to talk to me or Dave Johnson or whoever was doing the games and ask questions so that when he went on TV, he sounded like he knew what the hell he was talking about, because he did. He got it from the people that knew. These are smart people. So all these guys that do these games, and it's a really close-knit fraternity. All these dudes are good friends of mine, and I miss seeing them, and I'm still, I text back and forth with Ian Eagle during games and Mike Breen and these guys. Joel Myers is one of my closest friends. We text all the time. We hang out together, go to dinner when he's in DC. So it's a really neat, close-knit fraternity. Everybody looks after everybody else. Everybody roots for everybody else. Everybody appreciates the talent that everyone has.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, well, several years ago, you were doing like a reunion thing at Capital One. Maybe it was Verizon back then. And I remember you had Earl LaPearl was there, Phil was there. You had all these people came back. I forgot what the occasion was, but you were running the show. And I remember thinking, because I happened to have good seats that night, someone had got me up there, and I could tell you had a close relationship with lots of these players. I could just tell by the way you guys were interacting, even though you had to concentrate on what you were doing. Is there anything wrong with that? If you're doing play-by-play with the team, do you want to keep a distance, or do you build relationships with these players over the years?
Well, actually, it's just the opposite. Well, first of all, if you're the local play-by-play announcer, not doing network games, even to extent network games. But if you're the local broadcaster, absolutely, you want to be as involved as you can. You want to make relationships if you can. You want to get to know these guys. You want them to know you, because that's how you glean, information. That's how you get stuff. That's how you stay on the inside and they don't look at you as an outsider. When I first did the Bullets games, Bullets, and then became Wizards that year, these guys knew me from Channel 5. I was at Channel 5 for 14 years. So they kind of were a little standoffish because they don't embrace the media. Most athletes I know do not care for the media.
Oh, you're not media. You're not considered media when you're a play-by-play.
Well, because they think you're out to get them.
Okay.
And especially in this day and age. Back then, I used to tell these guys, look, I'm not here to dig up dirt and create controversy. I'm here for pretty pictures and a good story. That's what I'm here for. So you don't have to worry about me talking badly or maliciously about you. And it took me a while for them to accept me as one of their own. And then once you get accepted, these guys, depending on how well you know them, they become your friends, and you can talk to them. I mean, I wasn't great friends with every player that we ever had on the team, but I got to be pretty good friends with a lot of guys that I think back with, Popeye Jones and Chris Whitney and Jawan Howard. And, to this day, guys that I'm still friendly with, Bobby Dandridge and Harvey Grant. And, some of these guys that played, on the team, you get to know these guys really well. The network announcers don't get to know them as well because they don't spend as much time with them, but you still, they know who you are and they know when you've said something bad about them. And sometimes they remember that. But for the most part, if you're fair, you get accepted by these guys. So it is incumbent upon yourself to interact with as many of them as you can. Now, look, the older you get, the bigger separation there is between these 22-year-olds and us, 3-4 decades. All right. So they don't find as much in common with us as they used to. But I remember when we had the big three, we had Karan Butler and Antoine Jameson and Gilbert Arenas and Brennan Haywood and these guys. The really smart guys would come to the back of the plane where me and Phil sat and interact with us because they knew that they wanted to get something from us. Well, as it turns out, all three of those guys, Brendan, Antoine, and Karan, had some sort of broadcasting, career after basketball.
Oh,
so they would come back to the back of the plane and BS with us, and we talk about stuff, and they learned from us. Brendan majored in communications in North Carolina, and he's really good on the air at what he does now. Karan's obviously an assistant coach, and Antoine is working with the team, but they all did TV, and I did games with Antoine and Karan, and so these guys were smart enough to do that. So you do develop relationships, and you do know dudes, and it's fun to know these guys and stay in touch with them. You can't help it. You live with these guys basically for 6 months. You're going to know them.
Yeah. Well, Steve, last question. I really appreciate your time. This has been amazing. It's a two-part question. Which of your calls, when you look back, are you most proud of? And which one would you want to have back, do over again? Is it the Joe Gibbs Playboy Super Bowl call? I mean,
I can answer both those questions unequivocally and without hesitation, Julian. My favorite call was Gilbert hitting the shot over Kirk Heinrich in Chicago in the playoff game. I think it was game 5. And it was an amazing shot. The picture, a lot of people have seen it. It's Heinrich with his arm extended and Gilbert up in the air, and he hits it. And I scream Dagger, and Phil yells. And to win that game in that atmosphere with those people, because in Chicago, they know what basketball is. And it was at, United Center. And it was just a thrilling moment. It was unbelievable. That's my favorite Dagger call. And there's been a few of them. Michael Jordan's had a couple. The call I want to have back was a Wizards game. We used to sit on the floor, okay? Most play-by-play announcers, broadcasters sit on the floor. But slowly they're moving guys off the floor because the owners realize they can sell those seats for lots of money. So they moved us up into the sort of the mezzanine section, about 20 rows up. I used to kid and say that I had a better view of Venus than I did the court. And in reality, it's a horrible place to broadcast from. It's terrible. You lose all your perspective. You can't talk to the officials. You don't hear the coaches when they say what they say. You don't get your inside look at the game by being on the floor. It's horrible. But you know what? Nobody cares, least of all the owners. They could care less. They're making millions of dollars from selling those seats. So they moved us up to halfway up there, and we're not even at midcourt. In a couple arenas we are. In Charlotte, Michael at least has you up at midcourt, but you're up. And in Philadelphia, you're up. And in a couple other arenas, you're up. So at Verizon Center, Capital One Arena, you're up. And your free throw line extended. You're not even at midcourt. So you don't even have the benefit of seeing, being at least that close to the other end of the court. You're on one side. So we're doing a game against Detroit. The Detroit announcer is sitting 2 people away from me, George Blaha. He's their announcer, play-by-play TV. And the Wizards come back from this deficit, and now it's right down to the wire. And it's the far side of the court from my perspective, the far side in the corner. And Trevor Ariza throws up a 3 and he hits it. And I scream Dagger. The Wizards have come back. The George Blaha, the Detroit announcer, says, "Oh, the Pistons lose. Last second shot by Trevor Ariza." And I'm looking at the floor and nobody's celebrating. And my director comes in my ear and he says, "I don't think the shot went in." And sure enough, the shot went underneath the rim, glanced the bottom of the net, which caused the net to pop up, and it didn't go in, and the
Wow.
Wizards lost, and I had to issue a retracted dagger. And to this day, and I mean, it became a huge story. The next day on PTI, Wilbon and Kornheiser talked about it. At least they prefaced it by saying, before they threw me under the bus, at least they said, listen, we know this guy. He's a DC guy. He's a friend. We know him forever. And then even Wilbon came to my defense and said, had they not moved these guys up into the stands, to sell these seats, that would have never happened, which it wouldn't. Had I been on the floor, I would have clearly seen that the ball didn't go in the basket. But where we were, and I've watched it, Julian, 100 times, every time I watch it, I think that ball went in the net. Everybody on this side of the arena thought the ball went in, but it didn't. And that's one of the disadvantages of being moved to where we are. You don't have the same vantage point. But again, fans don't know the difference and nobody cares. You have to just do the game. So that's what I remember about that. And there was one other one I'll share with you. It was a tragic day in my career. I was doing play-by-play for what was then Home Team Sports. And it was American University and might have been GW or one other kind of local team. And I'm doing the game on TV, and my color commentator, my expert analyst, is Doc Walker. Okay, so he's doing the color and I'm doing the play-by-play. And there's a local guy who's the producer of the game, a fellow who actually went to American University. He's producing the game and he's in the truck. So at halftime of the game, I'm supposed to interview the president of American University, Dr. Benjamin Ladner. Okay. I never met him, but I'm supposed to interview him. And we have a stage manager there who's sort of helping me, giving me some stuff to read during the game and sort of helping with the broadcast and all of that. You always have a stage manager. Halftime comes, Doc gets up and leaves. He goes to shake hands with everybody, and everybody wants to shake hands with Doc. And now I'm waiting for my halftime interview, Dr. Benjamin Ladner, to come and sit down. Comes down, we shake hands. How you doing? We're off camera, we shake hands. He sits down, put the headsets on. We come back out of commercial and I say, it's halftime at American University and the Eagles lead the Colonials, 33-32. And happy to have with me now, joining me is the president of American University, Dr. Benjamin Ladner. They take a two shot and it's me and him sitting there. And the guy looks at me and he goes, shakes his head. And I said, oh, you're not a doctor. I've elevated you to doctoral status. And we're on camera. And he looks at me and he grabs his mic like this and he looks at me and he says, he mouths the words, I'm not that guy, Buck. He says that to me. I'm not that guy. Now you can imagine what's running through my body. Adrenaline, chills, emotion of anger. This is not Benjamin Ladner sitting next to me. Okay. Now I can't bring myself to say to this man on camera, who are you? I can't do it. I just can't do it. I'm looking at him and now the producer's in the truck and he's seeing this obviously. And I was always, carried a little bit of anger towards him because he went to American University. He knew this wasn't Benjamin Ladner. He should have said before we even came on camera, that ain't him. Get that guy out of there. So we go to a wide shot. Finally, after what seemed like 2 minutes, it was more like 10 seconds. We go to a wide shot. I take off my headset and I say to this person, who are you? He says to me, I'm Jason Shrinsky. Well, as it turns out, he's an attorney in town. He had represented some athletes, and I had actually met him before, and he had just come down at halftime to say hi to me.
Oh.
But because nobody was there to say, are you Dr. Ladner? I figured it was Dr. Ladner. He sits down, we put on the headsets. He figures I'm going to interview him at halftime. All right, so now at least I know who he is.
Yeah.
We come back and I say, we have Jason Shrinsky with us at halftime. Jason, what do you think about the American University basketball program? And he says, well, I think that Steve Yockey's doing a great job. Well, it was Chris Nockey who was the coach. And, and some other things. And I asked him like 2 more questions, and then we got him out of there. Go to commercial. Now the real Dr. Ladner shows up, and he sits down, and I say, listen, here is Dr. Benjamin Ladner. I said, there was an imposter sitting in this seat a few minutes ago, but it's great to have you on the air. So those 2 things, Julian, are the most embarrassing moments of my broadcast career. The missed Dagger, the retracted Dagger, and the Dr. Benjamin Ladner / Jason Shrinsky story.
Well, those are great stories, but you've had such a profound effect. You trained some of the lingo in DC. The Dagger is even used, I think, in the dating scene around DC bars because of Steve Buckhantz. When you're doing the play-by-play for a team, what you want to do is you want to build that relationship with your audience, and they want to come not just to see the Wizards, but they want to come see Steve. And I think you successfully were able to do that. I mean, you really influenced the language in the Washington, D.C. area.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I did it for 22 years. So if you have a catchphrase like, Bob Carpenter has "see you later," and Dave Johnson, when he does soccer, is in the net and stuff like that. You develop things, and if they're good, I almost lost the Dagger call because my general manager at the TV station at the time when I was at Home Team Sports, or then it was probably Comcast Sportsnet, a wonderful man named Sam Schroeder who's passed on. I was start to scream Dagger, and he said to me once, he said, listen, I don't know about the Dagger thing. He says it's got a bad connotation, and sometimes you say it for the other team. And it was just about the time when it was starting to present itself in the vernacular locally. Like the Sports Junkies had a great impact on that, and they used it in their broadcast on the radio, and they helped make it really popular. So I said this to our general manager. I said, listen, I understand. I won't use it against the team anymore. I only use it for the team. I said, but I'm becoming associated with that, and I'd hate to give it up. And to his credit, he realized that was true. And he said, okay, you can keep using it. And so I now have the word trademarked.
Cool.
I have it trademarked, and I've in fact, there was a FanDuel commercial that's been running. You may have seen it if you watch Wizards games, where they show and the announcer says, we can make a layup look like a big time shot, and we can make a free throw look like a half court dagger. They show Bradley Beal at the free throw line. He says, we can make a free throw look like a half court dagger. Well, I had to have the attorneys call them and tell them you can't use that. And now if you hear the commercial, the announcer says, we can make a free throw look like a half court bomb. Took the word out because they're not allowed to use it. So now I would never call up ESPN and say, hey, your announcers aren't allowed to use it, because I do have a trademark for broadcast use, but I would never do that. But I do have a trademark. So, you develop these things that people hear over the course of years. And, that's just the way it is. When you're on the air for that long, people come to know who you are, and they and at Channel 5, I had so many guys working with me. I mean, Scott Van Pelt was my intern. Gus Johnson was my intern. Kevin Sheehan, who does radio, Scott Lynn, all these guys. Chick Hernandez obviously did weekends with me. I mean, all these guys have gone on to have these, great careers, and I like to think I had maybe a little something to do with it, but it's a great fraternity.
Yeah, it's true, and that's to your credit, and also to your credit that people always feel like you're a regular guy. You always seem like you were really approachable. Again, like I said about my mother, she was so excited that I was talking.
I love that.
You. Yeah, because I think she feels like she knows you. So I guess that's in your business, that's probably a high compliment.
Well, that is a high compliment, Julian. I appreciate you saying that. I appreciate you having me on. And I'll tell you, look, I'm not. It's not like I'm going to leave some kind of legacy or anything like that. But people who have met me or know of me through broadcasting, whether it be Channel 5 or the Wizards or whatever, radio or whatever it happens to be, I think that what you just said is, to me, the highest compliment that I can receive in this business. I don't know about anybody else that's in the business, but that is that, he's a regular guy, because there's so many people in my business, man, that have these gigantic heads and they're really cocky and they're not approachable. And I just don't think, being on TV makes you that special. It makes you that recognizable, but I don't think it makes you that special. So the accolades are nice. And if somebody meets me and they come away with that meeting by saying, hey, he's a regular guy, then that's the best compliment I could get.
Yeah. Well, you deserve it. And look, I really appreciate you doing this. Maybe I love at some point, I know you're friends with my buddy Tim. Maybe at some point we can go out and get beers and watch a game or just and meet in person. I think that'd be great.
I would love to. I got lots of free time now, Julian. So I ended up doing a bunch of James Madison football and basketball games this year, but their seasons are over. I do some radio in the morning, not every day, just on Monday mornings with Don Geronimo on Big Run 100. He called, another old guy like me, and he called and said, hey, will you talk sports with me for 5 minutes? I said, yeah, I'd love to. So I do that with him on Monday mornings. But other than that, I got a lot of free time, Julian, to play bad golf. So let's do something.
Yeah. Well, I will definitely take you up on that. And again, I really appreciate you doing this. This has been a lot of fun.
My pleasure. I had a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Okay. All right, Steve, let's keep in touch.
All right, buddy. Take care.
You too.